And so shortly after 3 Day Road came out, I got a call from him, and I'm really nervous. Oh my God, John Ralston Saul called me and asked me to his house. So I go to his house, and he sits me down, and if you know John, he's very smart and very tall, and he sits with his legs crossed, and he's like, well, Joseph, I've started this series called The Extraordinary Canadians, and I'd like you to be a part of it. I was like, John, that's so kind of you. Come on, I've only written one novel. At least let me write a few more before, And he's like, no, it's not about you. I'd like you to write a part of the series on Louis Riel and Gabriel. Oh, he only said Louis Riel at that point, and I said, oh, okay, yeah, I know Louis. And keeping it Riel, and he was like, yeah, no, that's him. And so I said, absolutely. I was very naive. I said, sure, I'll jump right into it. Maybe I can be one of the first in the Extraordinary Canadian series. Eventually there were 19. My book, I think, came out 16th, so you can see how long it took me. But I started with this, I said, yeah, absolutely. And you know what, John? I'm not just going to write about Louis Riel. I'm going to do what no one else has ever done. I'm going to write about Gabriel Dumont as well in the same book. He's like, oh, fascinating. And what he was really saying is good luck, because there's a reason no one had ever written about the two together. The sheer mass of information that came together that I had to wade through. And it wasn't wading often, but like really kind of work through was huge. And so I entered into this whole project so naively, as I always do, and I'll talk about that with 3 Day Road shortly. But I entered into this project really naively, saying, no problem, it's just about these two dudes. I can do this. And quickly I realized how little I actually knew, not how much. And that's where the journey started, feeling immediately getting the books and then seeing more books and then buying more books until I suddenly had stacks all around me of all these academics telling me who these men were. And what was amazing, especially Riel, that one academic would say one thing, one would say the other. And so I was left stymied. I was like, what? Who was this guy? Who really was this person? And so that was one of the big journeys I went on in writing this book. But Gabriel Dumont, there's some written about him, but Woodcock has a biography that's just brilliant. If you've not read the Woodcock biography of Gabriel Dumont, it still stands up as being just a wonderful story and a really, really well-researched story. So I had this kind of quandary to face. Riel was so complicated in so many ways, and one person would say one thing, one would say the other. But Dumont everyone kind of agreed, was like the last hero of the Canadian West. He's the last to be the captain of the buffalo hunt before the buffalo disappeared. He could sing in the buffalo. He could shoot the head off of a duck from 100 paces. He could ride for days. He had his rifle he called Le Petit, Mon Petit, that he could kill you with very easily. And so he was a fascinating character, very straightforward, straight shooting in many ways, whereas Riel was the real mystery. And so it took me about 2 years of researching and thinking, how the heck, because the Extraordinary Canadian series are all quite slim. They're not big tomes. They're not encyclopedic. And so I was like, how am I going to possibly do what I've promised? And I really want to do this because no one had ever put these two guys together. They've never put them together and allowed them to kind of come on the page and live and breathe together. And then I realized, you know what, they didn't know each other that long. And I think a lot of Canadians are surprised that they only knew each other in the last year and a half or so of Riel's life. A lot of people assume they grew up together and that because they were Métis, they knew each other. There is evidence that they had contacted one another back in 1869, 1870 during the first rebellion. But they didn't know each other. And that's evidenced by Dumont decides in 1884 in the spring to ride down to Montana, where Riel is still living in self-imposed exile at this point, but in exile nonetheless, teaching in a little school for Indian children on a reservation. And Dumont rides into town with a few of his partners and relations to ask Riel to come back. We need you in Canada. The same thing that was happening 15, 20 years ago is happening again, but this time further out west. And the Métis are being threatened. We need you. And that's all Riel needed. But when Dumont pulls up to see Riel, Riel says, "I do not know you, but clearly you know me," kind of thing. So they did not know each other, and that's when it clicked for me. Okay, I get it now. This is how this book will transpire. I can deal with this. I can deal with the year and a half of their life together, filling in the necessaries where I need to go. And that's when the kind of I felt comfortable starting in on this project. So I've compared the two very, very different men. And obviously the first question I had to try to tackle, and the last question, and it remains a question, is the question of Riel's sanity, or insanity. He did spend almost 2 years in different asylums in Quebec. He certainly did have very interesting theories about his bowel movements and about his bodily functions that might be questioned. Or he certainly had a very strange, some might say, view of how Western Canada was going to become the new Rome, that the old Rome was a whited sepulchre, that the old Rome was corrupt, and now it was time for the Northwest to become the new Rome. He had strange ideas about who the next pope should be. You have to understand Riel. He was the oldest of many, many children. He was one of the first Metis to go to university. He left his family, taken away from his beloved mother and beloved father, sent to Montreal, and he wanted to go. But his father died during that time, which I think really affected him. He was very well educated, really bright, very well read, was no country bumpkin, that's for sure. But the question of his sanity or insanity always arises. John Ralston Saul said to me, by the way, he and I went on a tour of Canada together. It was, I was doing Riel Dumont, and he was doing, oh my God, I'm going to forget, it was 2 years ago. They were pretty interesting dudes, though, from what I remember. But we went across Canada on this tour together, and I compared us to Sammy Davis and Dean Martin doing our kind of literary tour of the country. But John, at one point one night in a kind of shared conversation in front of an audience, said, to me, Riel is like that Russian mystic coming off the steps, appearing out of the steps, and bringing word of the Lord and of good and bad things to come. And I thought, that's fascinating. And then it made me start thinking, well, Riel's sanity has always been questioned, and his insanity. And there are so many other historical figures who come off just as kooky as him, but they're never questioned. Think a certain prime minister who'd talk to his dog in order to get through to his dead wife, right? And Mackenzie King. The list goes on and on and on. But why do we tie so strongly this idea of was Riel insane to this man? Because what he asked for was anything but insane. What he was demanding for the Métis was simple, straightforward, and fair. I'm going to read a little passage. When Riel arrived in 1884, immediately he won over everyone, including the priests, including former enemies from Manitoba. And so how insane could he have been? Was he that good a master of disguise? He won over everybody. Everyone was like, yes, he speaks well. Look at this guy. He's really speaking well. He knows what we're talking about. He's focused. He's educated. Maybe this is the guy we send to Ottawa to talk to them. But the Métis made a list of demands, a list of requests of the federal government. I'm just going to go over them with you, if you don't mind, because it really kind of highlights anything but insanity. And I'm speaking today assuming that you have some background of the original 1870 insurrection or forming of Manitoba, and then 1884 being very much a mirror image of what was happening back then. But the Métis gather at Saint Laurent Church in large numbers on March 7, when the bad news has settled over the land like more snow. With the support of Gabriel, Louis announces that a provisional government should be created based on the abdication of federal government functions through neglect. Louis has reworked the petition so recently shot down by Ottawa as a Bill of Rights for the people with 10 straightforward points. And I'll read them to you and tell me if any of them sound mad or unfair. 1, that the half-breeds of the Northwest Territories be given grants similar to those accorded to the half-breeds of Manitoba by the Act of 1870. 2, that patents be issued to all half-breed and white settlers who have fairly earned the right of possession on their farms. They simply want to own the land and not have it taken away. 3, that the provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan be forthwith organized with legislatures of their own, so that the people may no longer be subjected to the despotism of a Mr. Dewdney. 4, that in these new provincial legislatures, while representation according to population shall be the supreme principle, the Métis shall have a fair and reasonable share of representation. So the Métis, we're not coming in and saying, we're going to control legislature, we're going to control everything. We just want to be recognized within the political system. 5, that the offices of trust throughout these provinces be given to the residents of the country as far as practicable, and that we denounce the appointment of the disreputable outsiders and repudiate their authority. There was a lot of land claiming going on by people from Ontario. 6, that this region be administered for the benefit of the actual settler and not for the advantage of the alien speculator. 7, that better provision be made for the Indians, that parliamentary grant to be increased and land set apart as an endowment for the establishment of hospitals and schools for the use of whites, half-breeds, and Indians at such places as the provincial legislatures may determine. That one's always struck me as incredibly forward-thinking. This is something that Canada still struggles to do and is not able to do, but we need to. 8, that all lawful customs and usages which obtain among the Métis be respected. Respect our customs. 9, that the land department of the Dominion government be administered as far as practicable from Winnipeg, so that the settlers may not be compelled as heretofore to go to Ottawa for the settlement of questions and dispute between them and the land commissioner. 10, that the timber regulations be made more liberal, and that the settler be treated as having rights in this country. And so this is what they sent, this kind of Bill of Rights. Please, will you respect these, to John A. And what John A. was masterful at doing is completely ignoring the Métis demands until things festered to the point of no return. And we all know the 1884, 1885 uprising in the Northwest didn't go so well for the Métis. At first, it went tremendously well. And one of the kind of more fascinating things I found, and I didn't even jot it down, but it comes to mind right now, when I was working on the book, is how brilliant Dumont was as a strategist, as a general, as a leader of troops. He proved a few times, as the Canadians came in, that he could overwhelm and scare off a force 10 times his size. He was a master of guerrilla warfare. He was a tactician. He knew, even with if you had low ammunition, how to get around troops with limitless ammunition. He proved this over and over again, but I think if he had a fatal flaw, it was that he put too much reliance on Riel, or belief in Riel as being someone who God was directly telling what needed to happen. Riel constantly undercut Dumont. I truly believe that Dumont could have been successful, held off the Canadian Army to the winter, and the winter would have done the job for him of sending them packing, giving the Métis basically a way to go back to Ottawa and say, listen, you can do it again, it's the same thing's going to happen, let's make a deal. But Riel said, no, we can't do any of this guerrilla tactics, it's too Indian, which was interesting. We can't act like savages. And I don't want a lot of killing. And Dumont is thinking, well, this is an armed rebellion, there's going to be killing. It's going to happen. And so Dumont was incredibly respectful throughout the whole process. He never once raised his voice to Riel. He never questioned him outwardly, never fomented his own rebellion within the provisional government. But he listened to Riel, and that ultimately was his downfall and the downfall of the Métis resistance in 1885 is my own personal theory. And I think it's one shared by a lot of people. Well, it didn't go well. As we all know, the Métis lost at Batoche over the course of a few days against overwhelming odds. They lost, I think it was 25 killed and many wounded. So it was by any means of a rebellion anywhere in the world. It was not a gigantic rebellion, but the aftershocks and the shock waves in Canada were tremendous, and we still feel them to this day. And then it came time for Louis. Riel was captured right away. Dumont slipped away. He was going to give himself up, but then slipped away. Riel is captured by General Middleton and brought to Regina to trial. And Riel firmly believed that he was not going to be treated he'd be treated as an enemy combatant, but not as somebody who would be executed. He truly believed at this point, they can't do that to me, can they? Will they do that? I'm just fighting for the rights of my people and fighting for Canada. I helped create Manitoba. Would they truly do this? And he was naive in thinking that, because the Canadian government came on full on. Johnny MacDonald, word from on high, down to the trial judge. Nah, this guy's got to go. We got to get rid of him. And so I'm going to read I'm going to read a short section about how the trial kind of unfolded and how immediately you recognize, and Riel recognized, that things were so stacked against him. And so this is Louis in Regina. After 6 weeks languishing in his tiny jail cell, Louis, with little knowledge of what his lawyers are thinking or even when they might arrive so that he can meet them, is taken to the courthouse in Regina, a few miles from his jail cell. Still fearing that the warrior Gabriel Dumont will stage a daring rescue, the Mounties go to strange lengths to foil such an attempt, dressing Louis up as a policeman and sitting him in a wagon for his first ride to court, with 3 real policemen at his side. It's a large and daunting caravan, and Gabriel, hundreds of miles away, is unaware of the stir he continues to cause. Rumors have been circulating that Gabriel is going to sweep in with his Metis, regather the forces, and free Louis. According to the court system, Louis must be charged with an actual crime by someone called a claimant. For reasons that remain murky, the man chosen to be the claimant is the police chief of Hamilton, Ontario, a town thousands of miles away. In what seems for Louis another sure sign that he's doomed, this police chief is a member of the Orange Order. Louis is charged with high treason, waging war on representatives of the Queen's government. As Louis knows only too well, death by hanging awaits upon conviction. I'm not checking email, I'm just checking time. Louis is very smart, but he has no legal training. When he finds out that the acting judge will be a man named Hugh Richardson, he has even more reason for deep concern. Richardson is not a judge in the proper sense. He's what's called a stipendiary magistrate, a barrister of at least 5 years' experience who serves as part-time judge in the thinly populated Northwest Territories. Stipendiary magistrates are hired by the administration in Ottawa, an administration that holds no love for Louis. Their job is to help ease the duties of the few overworked real judges in the area. Louis must wonder why a full-time judge isn't assigned to sit on what should be regarded as a pretty important trial. Worse, he finds out that Mr. Richardson, yet another Orangeman, served as counsel for the territorial governor in 1880 and once wrote a letter to the Ministry of the Interior strongly condemning the Métis leaders as evil influences doing no good for the half-breeds. Louis must also be distressed to learn that rather than the typical 12 jurors, with its greater chance to find empathetic men among that number, a trial under a stipendiary magistrate requires only 6 jurors. Louis' lawyers are 9 days away from arriving, and Richard has scheduled the trial to begin on July 20th, which means they will have only a few days to prepare. What more can possibly be stacked against him? As it turns out, plenty. When the jury is eventually selected, all 6 are white, English, and Protestant. When Louis' lawyers move to have the trial taken to Winnipeg, where Louis might find a little sympathy, the judge quickly shuts them down. Louis Riel will face trial in hostile Regina, and his fate will be decided by a judge and 6 men who have very little in common with the Métis, who in fact have more interest in crushing the half-breed movement. On July 15th, 5 days before the trial is to begin, Louis' lawyers finally arrive in Regina. The one hotel in town is already filled with reporters and the curious, so the first night the lawyers are forced to sleep on a floor. In what can only be called a media scrum, Louis meets his defenders in front of a group of clamoring reporters. He immediately expresses how happy he is to see that these men represent different languages, nationalities, and religions. Louis, as always, firmly believes that inclusion, not exclusion, is what wins the day. For the first time in a very long time, he doesn't feel quite so alone anymore. quite so vulnerable and in the dark, but this is not to last long. And so that's just a setup to the trial. The trial itself, I think it was Clayton Ruby a number of years ago, retried the Riel trial acting as Louis' attorney, and he exonerated him completely. The trial was really already a pre-made conclusion. I think a lot of people truly believe. John A. MacDonald had passed on that no, Riel needs to be made an example of. He was a real thorn in John A.'s side, and he wasn't going to stick around for long. And that brings us, I could talk more about the trial, but I want to jump to the execution because I still want to talk about a 3-day road and how the two relate and the years in between. The execution was, again, I don't want to call it fascinating because that's not the right word for it, but it was a very troubling affair. I'm going to, again, read this short section where Louis has now been convicted and sentenced to death. It all happens very, very quickly. A number of times his lawyers try to stop this, and it's turned back every time. Experts in the field, a number of them even agree Louis should not be hanged. World outcry at this point. This has hit the international papers in England and France, across Europe, and they're all saying, Canada, you can't do this to this guy. But they push ahead anyways. And so this is Louis' last morning. The morning is bright and cold. Despite this, Louis sweats. He can feel the beads of it on his face, a cold sweat, a night sweat like one that comes with bad dreams. As Father Andre walks with him to where the rope awaits, the priest stumbles, and Louis whispers for him to have courage. Let's stop there just for 1 sec, because that's fascinating. Father Andre was the priest in Batoche who fought hard against Louis for the whole time Louis was there. Actually probably turned him in, had a lot to do with Louis' defeat and the defeat at Batoche. And so at this point, Father Andre and Louis had become very close now that he's on death row. They were enemies as much as they can be, as two Catholics, deeply religious Catholics can be up to this point. By the gallows now, a rope is placed loosely about Louis' neck. The deputy asks if there are any last words. Louis can hear Father Andre crying, his head turned away. Shall I say something? Louis asks, concerned now for the priest's weakness. Maybe there's something still to be said. No, the priest chokes. Louis requests time to pray some more. He is given 2 minutes. The other priest accompanying the party, this one sent by sympathizers from Toronto, suggests that Louis recite the Lord's Prayer. The priest then leans to the deputy and tells him to command the hangman to pull the lever when Louis reaches the line, "Deliver us from evil." The deputy nods. It isn't so much an act of cruelty as one of mercy. Louis won't suspect it at that moment. Gabriel must shake with anger when he is told of this next part, the last cruel twist of injustice. The hangman approaches Louis, places a white cotton hood over his head, tucks it beneath the rope before roughly tightening the cord about his neck, then spits in Louis' ear. "Louis Riel, do you know me? You cannot escape from me today." As it turns out, a man who bears a personal grudge against Louis has been allowed to act as his executioner, something even the most barbaric of societies frown upon. The executioner claims to have been taken prisoner by Riel's men in the Red River Resistance back in 1870, and he further claims to have been a friend of the rabid dog Thomas Scott. The executioner has waited 15 years for the chance to whisper this to Louis. His ugly words mar an otherwise respectful day. Ironically, the last words, the last prayer of Louis' life are spoken in English. As the Toronto priest has requested, while the last line of the Lord's Prayer is being recited, the trapdoor swings open, and Louis, not quite yet ready, falls 9 feet before his body jerks to a stop and then begins to convulse. Over the course of 2 minutes, the convulsions continue, slowing eventually to twitches, and then finally to stillness. Father Andre, reporting it all to his superiors, writes, "Riel died a saint." And so for Father Andre to report that Riel died a saint is a pretty serious and an amazing turnaround. If there's anything that I learned writing this book, it's when I got to the trial of Riel and I pored over the documents. You can still get the actual court documents and verbatim. Was that Riel came off as anything but insane. He came off as somebody who was couldn't believe what was going on around him. His own lawyers were arguing for his insanity. And Riel couldn't, he tried to stop the trial and fire them because he said that if I am proven insane, then my cause is proven insane. You can't do this to me. His lawyers tried to say he was insane in order to save him, to save his neck, literally. And then the Crown is arguing, no, Riel is absolutely sane. Look, he did all this, he's clearly a sane man. So this continues on and on, the insanity thing, which I think won't ever be answered. And then Dumont, we talk about Gabriel. I've really kind of focused on Louis today, and I hate doing that because Gabriel was, as I keep saying, was fascinating, was amazing. He left, escaped to America, eventually joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show shortly after Riel's death. And I was supposedly went to France, but there's no evidence of that with the Wild West show. Eventually ended up in Quebec when he was exonerated and allowed to come back. And then eventually home to Batoche. He was finally, in the last few years of his life, in the early 1900s, finally was given ownership of his land at Gabriel's Crossing, a place where Maria Campbell lives today. And where does that leave us, I guess, is the question with Riel and Dumont. And that's what, in the Extraordinary Canadian series, they ask each of the authors to do, is write a short epilogue and try to sum up where you feel or where you think you are at that point. And so this is what I wrote, and this will be the last thing I read from Riel and Dumont, then we'll move on. Okay, the epilogue. I stand with my hands up on the chain-link fence, staring at the place a stone's throw away where Louis Riel was hanged. There's no statue, no marker, no way you'd ever know that this is the spot without some pretty serious research and a touch of the detective in you. I'm on the edge of a property called The Depot in Regina, Saskatchewan. It's the home and training grounds of our country's RCMP. I'd wanted to stand in that place where Louis hovered above the ground in the last instant of his life, but no one with the proper authority is available today to accompany me. And so I'm here with my hands up on the fence, a Metis outsider staring in at the old chapel that was once the guardhouse that held Louis. Maybe it's a little morbid, but I can picture Louis stepping out of the second-story window of this chapel that was once the guardhouse and onto the scaffolding of the long-gone gallows, bookended by policemen and followed by a crying Father Andre with his long white beard and black robes. I can picture Louis with the rope around his neck, staring ahead and mumbling prayers under his breath, questioning for a moment how he ended up here in this place, on this day, the last one of his life. Does he regret his actions as he stands on the scaffold? The year before my visit to Regina, I fly to Saskatoon, rent a car at the small airport, and begin to drive. It's a gorgeous summer day, the prairie fields exploding with wildflowers. I'm surprised as I drive north how these prairies aren't flat at all, but undulate like waves on a great ocean. I try to picture Gabriel riding through the same country, hunting buffalo as a younger man, or as he hits middle age, evading the military as he rides away from Batoche to a different kind of captivity from Louis, this one in the States. I turn east up the main highway onto a secondary one, and then onto an even smaller road. Following this, I'm surprised to feel my heart rate quicken as I close in on my first destination. As the wide river comes in sight, sparkling in the brilliant sunshine, I smile to myself, understanding now in this very moment why a people would be willing to fight and die for such a place. It's beautiful. The poplar leaves along the river shimmering in the breeze, the South Saskatchewan curving like a smile. I drive slowly over the steel bridge that is Gabriel's Crossing, taking it all in, the shining water, the thick growth of trees along the bank, the fertile ground sloping up and stretching out for miles. The only structure around, a well-kept house with a large teepee in the backyard, piques my interest. I won't bother the owner today. Instead, I continue my exploration. I take my time, traveling unimpeded through the square miles surrounding Batoche, surveying a couple of the original rifle pits protecting the village, spending a few hours at the annual Back to Batoche festival, driving out to Fish Creek and seeing firsthand the place where Gabriel not only held off Middleton and his army, but beat them soundly when they dared encroach too close to his home. It's almost as if I wander through a dream, traversing this country that was Gabriel Dumont's. Something tells me he never did regret his actions, and I can see now, absorbing the majesty of this land, that neither did Louis. The fenced-in depot in Regina and the wide-open country surrounding Batoche could not be more different. They represent the two worlds of the Métis experience, the open freedom they continually sought as they pushed farther and farther west, and the fences that Canadian authorities never stopped building to try to contain a people who were too free, too Indian in their outlook. These two places encompass both the promise and the near destruction of a people. They also speak to the two opposing forces that have always made up this country, the wilderness and the desire to constrain it. During the long voyage of writing this book, I came early on to the understanding that in some ways Gabriel represents the Indian in the Métis and Louis the European. Gabriel, a master hunter and speaker of indigenous languages, lived on and for the land. Louis, university educated and deeply Catholic, never seemed fully comfortable in the wilderness and instead continually strove for a way to build his vision of a new church, a new society in the wilds of the West. And when these two powerful men came together in 1884 and 1885, a truly united Métis worldview emerged, one that John A. Macdonald quickly recognized was a threat to his vision of Canada. These Métis, these half-breeds, our first Prime Minister realized, could not be controlled on reserves in the same way he tried to control the Indians. Depending on how one sees it, John A.'s strategy of simply ignoring Métis petitions for so many years either backfired tragically or succeeded brilliantly when Dumont and Riel forced his hand by announcing a provisional government. Ironically or not, John A.'s inaction created the military action that attempted, once and for all, to crush the Métis nation. Clearly, though, this nation is resilient. Well over 300,000 people in Canada are enrolled Métis, and many, many thousands more self-identify as Métis. The Métis homeland includes regions in 9 of our 10 provinces, as well as the Northwest Territories. Métis populations are also found in parts of Montana, North Dakota, and Minnesota. The people, they aren't going anywhere. We, are a part of the landscape that is our country. But do characters like Gabriel Dumont and Louis Riel matter in our contemporary world? Do we need the ghosts of these men in our busy, modern lives? I believe the answer is self-evident, especially when I look across Canada in the 21st century. The rebel in me, that person who won't be pushed around by bullies or faceless institutions, sees a direct link between the struggle of a people 125 years ago and the struggles of so many average Canadians today. As representatives of their community, Louis and Gabriel struggled against the entity that called itself progress and took the physical, often bullying form of the surveyor, the politician, and finally the railroad. This, to me, is the same struggle so many of us face today. Modern industry and multinational corporations are our very own contemporary progress. From our hunger for oil to our over-reliance on personalized technology, we sometimes lose ourselves. I don't argue that progress is a bad thing, just as Gabriel and Louis would not have argued that. But the lesson learned from Riel and Dumont is that progress, in whatever form it takes, should never be allowed to trample the rights of the community or the broader culture. Progress, in all its forms, should serve us, not us it. That history lesson, for me, is the most important one of all. And so that's what I walked away with from Riel and Dumont. I'm going to transition a bit from 1885 on, and it won't be as long, because I understand there's a rockin' reception after, so I hope I get to meet some of you too, please. So I think 1885, it proved a bit of a pivotal year for our nation of Canada for a couple of reasons that I wonder if it's coincidental or not. Riel is hanged in 85. The Métis problem is finally solved. Problem in quotations. Which means the Indian problem is on its way to being solved. And what happens in the Indian Act in 1885, as I was talking about with the brilliant David McNabb in the car ride here from Waterloo is that in 1885 they changed the Indian Act to allow the church and state to take over the reserve schools, creating the residential school system. And so I find this wildly either coincidental or maniacally brilliant. I'm not sure which it is. It might be a titch of both, I don't know. But we all know about residential schools, or at least we hear about them. We hear about the impact. Most of us don't feel the impact, but we hear about it. And let me just very briefly, I'm not going to lecture you on residential schools, but we all know this, that children were forcefully taken from their parents' arms, often literally, put into institutions where their hair was cut, their dress was changed, their diet was changed, their language was changed, their culture was attempted to be strangled. And what was the saying that the federal government used was along the lines of, we must kill the Indian and the child in order to save the man. So can you imagine today, like watching a TV show and a commercial pops up? We must kill the Indian and the child in order to save the man. This became the slogan. This was like, can you imagine a better government? Kill the Indian and the child to save the man. And this is really, truly what the government thought they could do and pull off over the course of a couple of generations. Oh, it's simple. Don't let them speak their language. Don't let them practice their religion. Take them away from their parents. They'll become white like us. At least they'll be brown-skinned white people. They'll change, they'll be made into apples, brown on the outside, white on the inside. And clearly this did not work, but it took us how many years? Do you know when the last residential school in Canada closed its door? 86, right? And most of them closed their doors in the 70s, and this is not a long time ago. And these institutions, I don't think anyone's arguing, or it's a very small minority arguing that the institutions did any good at all. What they did was divide and conquer or attempt to a people. And so that's the residential school system that kicked into gear in 1885. By 1914, 30 years later, not that long, 29 years later, half a human's life at the time, World War I and the 20th century arrived with a bang, arrived with a roar. And in Canada especially, Canadians got very excited about the prospect of going over to Europe and defending the king and country. And so did a lot of First Nations. In fact, there were so many First Nations men joining the Canadian military in 1914, 15, 16, and 17 that often reserves were completely cleaned out of able-bodied men of age. The Canadian government was shocked and happily surprised to find that First Nations men were joining the military at far greater numbers per capita than any other group. And they couldn't figure it out. And they were also worried that, oh no, the Indians, this is great, we're getting numbers up, but the Indians, they can't work with white people. They're not going to get along. It's going to be, I can just imagine the nightmares that are going to ensue. And so there was actually talk, the Canadian Expeditionary Force, of creating an all-Indian battalion. It didn't happen because what the generals quickly learned was that the Indians not only got along really well, they often were amazing at their jobs. Look at Francis Pegamagabo from Wissahickon Reserve, my mother's land. Deadliest sniper in World War I, 378 enemy kills are given to him, the most highly decorated Indian soldier, one of the more highly decorated soldiers in that war, certainly the deadliest sniper in that war. Look at Henry Norwest, the Metis sniper. Look at Tom Longboat, the runner. They proved themselves time and time and time again. And so when I sat down to write 3 Day Road, my first novel, I wanted to write on a big panorama. I wanted to write a big novel. I didn't want a quiet little novel. I said I was naive. I'm always naive, it seems, when I go into writing a book. I was certainly naive going into this one. I was like, let's write a big World War I historical epic. That'll be easy. And 5 years later, I come crawling out. God, what was I doing? But there was a couple of things I had to come to terms with when I wrote this novel. One of them was certainly, I knew what this history was, how the people had been treated, the Aboriginal people in Canada. Why the heck were so many First Nations men willing, and they weren't even considered Canadians, not until the 1940s. They were aliens in their own land. Why would so many of these men fight for a country and for a king far away that really shat on them for many, many years? And so this is something I had to come to terms with in order to try to understand my characters. And obviously the most obvious answer came pretty quickly. Why does any young man or woman, for that matter, join a military to go off and fight in war? You know, there's the excitement of it, there's the romanticism, there's the idea of a steady paying job. And so certainly for First Nations men, this was a case. This is a chance to prove yourself equal to the person or the people who were colored white who had treated you like this. You could show that you're not even just as good, but you're better. But it had to be more than that, I thought. It had to be. And then I found out through research that oftentimes Indian agents who controlled all of the monetary coming into the reserve would lie. And this isn't all of them, but a number of them lied and said straight out to an army, which is a volunteer army. They said to these young Indian men, if you ever want to get your treaty money again, you're going to have to join the army. This was not a conscription army, by the way, so many men were bullied into it. But that wasn't the majority by any means. And then I once talked to an Ojibwe elder, and I said, why do you think so many went? And he said, well, think about it. For years and years, for a couple of generations already at least, you've been emasculated. You've been made to feel less than a man, less than human. What more could you want than to go out and say, no, I'm a warrior. This is something I want to do. There was an anger. There was a desire, a deep desire to prove oneself against those who had been telling you you weren't as good, you were no good. Another, I heard, this is pretty funny, another elder, I heard a interview with him a long time ago, and he said, well, they came to my reserve and they said, we're going to give you a gun, we're going to pay you, and you get to kill as many white people as you want. And I was like, I'm in. And he's like a great trickster joker guy, but it's this kind of thinking that this is my chance to prove not only to them, but to me that I am worthwhile, that I am worthy. And First Nations soldiers were incredibly adept, to say the least, and continue to be in our nation's military. I was just doing an interview, actually, as an aside with CBC about the War of 1812 in Tecumseh. Same thing. Whenever we need the Indians in a war, we call them right away, and they come. And then as soon as the war is over, go back to the reserve. The First Nations were promised in World War I the vote, number one, rights to their land, ownership to their land, number two, health, education benefits, just like every other member of Canada was getting, number three, and actually to become Canadian citizens. And guess what? In 1918, when the war ends on November 11th, they come home to the reserve, and nothing. No vote until 1960, 40 years later, 40 plus years later. And I don't tell you this to feel guilty or anything, but it's like, this is fact. This is Canadian historical fact. And you'll read the Globe and Mail, or you'll read the National Post, and anytime any First Nations issue come up, read the comments section, the opinions, and read the vitriol, the poison that spits out of them. And I just want to sit down with these people who are writing this anonymously always and say, no, let's re-look, let's reimagine this situation. Let's look at it from another lens. You get to be the First Nations person now. Try it. It's as simple as that. Walk a little ways in his shoes and see how you feel. But again, I'm going off on a tangent. When Francis Pega-Macabo came home, the most highly decorated First Nations veteran in Canada, the deadliest sniper in all of World War I, a parade was thrown for him in Toronto, and then he went back to his reserve of Wissahickon on Perry Island. Obviously, a man, after doing the job he did, is suffering from some post-traumatic stress disorder, shell shock, as they called it in World War I. He needed something to calm him. He said to himself, I came across many horses overseas, and I want to raise horses. I think this will calm me. I think this is a direction I want to go in my life. So he goes to the Indian agent. This is Francis Pega-Macabo. This isn't just an average guy. He goes, yeah, I think I want to raise some horses. I need a $300 loan. And the Indian agent looks at him and goes, how could I trust someone like you with live animals? That was his answer to Pegamagabo. And so imagine if you're just an unknown Indian soldier or veteran returning from the war, how you were treated. And this happened across the board. And again, unfortunately, it happened in World War II. It happened in Korea. I think times are changing slowly, but for the better. But I just wanted to put into context what First Nations were doing for Canada. So remember that next time you hear about Attawapiskat and this idea, oh, they just want handouts. It's like, no, sometimes when you're really desperate, you need a little bit of help. And there's nothing wrong with asking for help. Just remember how many times when we asked First Nations for help in this country, they came immediately and they put their lives on the line. We can do the same in return. And so I wrote this novel over the course of almost 5 years. I'm just going to read, rather than go on and on about it, there's two voices in this novel. And the more I thought about it, there is a connection in our history, and especially in my own personal history and what I'm writing. You know, this is the first in a trilogy of novels. When writing Riel, I didn't realize, well, this is kind of a non-fictional account of the setup to these novels. I'm writing a novel now that takes place much earlier in time that I'm realizing is connected to these novels as well. So I'm starting to see these strange connections in my creative world. But I thought I'm going to read two short readings so I don't keep us too long, or maybe just even one. And if there's any questions, we can go from there. I'm trying to decide. I'll let you guys decide. Should I read from Niska's point of view? She's the old bushwoman, or should I read from Xavier in war? Niska, put up your hand. Xavier, put up your hand. That's split. Okay, I'm going to read. I'll read a short Xavier piece that I've got, and then a short Niska piece. That'll work, and that way we can still have time for questions, because I don't want to keep it too long. It is Friday afternoon. Okay, well, I talked about res schools and all that, residential schools. I'm going to read a short section. As Niska's paddling Xavier home, he won't eat. He's dying. She needs to feed him something, so she begins feeding him stories of her life and of his life with her. And so I'm going to read a very short section of Niska when she's taken away, pulled from her mother's arm and forced into a residential school. I hope, if you've seen me read, I've not read this before, I apologize in advance, because I hate the idea of reading to somebody the same thing again, but this is short enough that I can get away with reading a short Xavier section. So this is her talking to Xavier. The building was large and white, bigger than the company's store, bigger than any structure I'd seen. They had us sleep in long rooms on rows of cots, and because I was older and knew very little of their language, the nuns paid very close attention to me. They kept me away from my sister. They didn't want me changing what they had taught Rabbit, who they now called Anne. The nuns would wake me in the middle of the night and drag me to a brightly lit room where I was made to repeat words over and over until I pronounced them correctly. When I was caught speaking my tongue, they'd force lye soap into my mouth and not give me anything else to eat for days. I watched as the younger children were beaten with switches and forced to eat food from the floor like dogs, but something in my eyes must have warned the nuns not to do the same to me. Every waking moment I planned my escape, sneaking bits of food into my scratchy dress pocket when no one was looking, noting the places where the warmer clothing and tools were kept that would serve me in the bush. The one in charge, Sister Agnes, took an immediate dislike to me in those first few weeks. She personally cut my hair, making it shorter than the rest of the girls. It took all that I had not to strike out at her to prevent her from doing it, but I knew to choose my battles carefully. They were going to remove the black hair that reached to my waist as a symbol of Wemshtigashu authority, of our defeat. She sat me in a chair, other nuns hovering in expectation of a fight, but I sat and smiled serenely as she tugged at my hair, pulling it hard to get a reaction from me that wouldn't come. When she was done and my scalp ached, I refused to look in the mirror that they shoved in front of me. I did not want to give them the reaction of shock and sadness that they had so wanted. I'd already planned my answer to their actions. Deep that night, when even the most vigilant nuns were sleeping, I crept down to the basement to the room where they sheared us like sheep, and I found the clippers used for the boys. I cut the rest of my hair from my head so that all that was left was a stubbly field. I lay awake in my bed all the rest of that night, rubbing my hand over my scalp in anticipation of the approaching dawn. In the morning, the nuns walked up and down our rows, pulling our covers from us and shouting at us to get up. When that moment finally came and I was left exposed, the room went silent, and child and adult alike stared at me. One of the nuns whispered, "Devil," and knowing better but not being able to help it, I smiled at this word. They dragged me from my bed then and pulled me down to the basement, locking me in a room with one window high above me. That was when I thought of my father and his last days. I wouldn't let the same cloud cover me. After a week of talking to no one and of being given a single bowl of porridge to eat each day, I began to have strange visions. Sister Agnes had told me that I would not come out again until my hair grew back. My hunger, combined with the thought of being in this little room with the single high window, caused the shaking to come to me, something that hadn't happened since my father died. It felt like a warm current running up my back and filling my head until I grew dizzy. Then my jaw tightened, and the tremors ran through my legs and lower torso, building in intensity until my whole body quaked and I fell to the ground. My vision turned red, and that was the last of my consciousness. There was no more room around me for this world then, only glimpses of the other place, and of what it took me a long time to realize was the future. I saw the bush once more, summertime or maybe autumn, the sun high, a beaver dam that had not been abandoned, a new lodge of freshly woven branches. I sat in a canoe with a young man paddling ahead of me. I didn't recognize him. His hair had been short like mine, but was already growing out. On a bend in the river, a large moose, a bull, stood on the shore. The same excitement that always comes with spotting one, especially one so large, swelled in me. But we did not take it. We drifted silently by with the current. Sitting alone in the room, I realized I was not going to be able to escape it. The window was too high, and the door that locked me in was solid. My hair had grown to a soft down, and I still did not regret my actions. I waited and dreamed and plotted. One night I awoke to a soft scratching at the window. I looked up and saw a shadow hovering by it. Before the panic even had a chance to grip me, the window crackled with the tinkling of glass. I crouched behind the bed and watched as the rest of the window was smashed out. With a flourish of long hair, my mother stuck her head in, and in the language I had not heard in weeks, she told me to throw her my bedsheet. I stood and did as she told me, all sleep quickly gone. She twisted the sheet and threw one end down and told me to grab it. She then hoisted me up and pulled me through the window, where I smelled the first fresh air in a long time. Spring had come while I sat in that room. "Ashton," she said, "come. They've probably heard us. We must go." I wondered where we were going, but that soon became apparent when she led me to our two dogs, both tied to travois with all of our possessions bundled on top. "Did you see Rabbit?" my mother asked. "Will she come with us?" "She's called Anne now," I said, and watched the understanding cross my mother's face. We led the dogs out of Moose Factory at that part of night when it was darkest, and I did not look again upon that place for another 2 years. My mother and I walked out of there and back into the time of our ancestors, living on what the land would give, and slowly becoming wild like the animals around us. And so I had to deal with Niska's section, but I also had to deal with Xavier and his memories of the war and of his best friend, of them going together and watching his best friend and he compete. Elijah loves this idea of competition, and he especially begins to love the idea of, I can get more kills than you can, Xavier, until Elijah starts getting a little bit nutty about it, starts going a little bit mad, starts going a little bit windigo or witigo, as the Ojibwe and Cree say. And so if there's any one place that I captured, I'm just going to read this, it's one page and then we'll open up to questions, but if there's one place that I captured or tried to capture Elijah starting to go a little bit nutty, this would be it. Constant back and forth shelling around here, and the trenches have been pummeled so often that some of them are more like shallow ditches than trenches. A constant threat of being attacked looms over us. More days of cold, relentless, pelting rain than days of dryness, and even with duckboards, the trenches fill with water. Many men fall to pneumonia, and many others suffer skin irritations from being constantly wet that turn into nasty festers. We've been issued tall rubber boots that reach up to the thighs, but in many places, these are not even tall enough and fill with water. A new expression to describe the condition of feet rotting in watery boots has appeared. When the soldiers see that their feet are black and swelling, they call it trench foot. Elijah and I immediately think of home here. In the spring and autumn, when we goose hunt along the rivers and the sodden, soft shores of the Great Bay, we live in cold rain for days on end and must learn to navigate the mud. It is a part of Cree existence. Elijah and I don't complain like the others, but focus our energy on staying alive and finding the little comforts, wait out the autumn, and avoid the shells that scream in randomly from the gray sky. We wear the tall moccasins I made for us a long time ago back in Canada. They dry quickly and allow our feet to breathe, and in this way we avoid foot trouble. The moccasins are the one break in dress code that McCann will allow. Just don't let Lieutenant Breach see them, he mutters. Trench raids against Fritz are impossible right now, as they are too well dug in, and even night patrols are rare in this weather. The mud and water hold the Canadians captive. We dig deeper into it and await what winter will bring. I am sick of the corpses around us, but in his boredom, Elijah volunteers for burial detail, taking the dead out of the line and down the dangerous alleys of support trenches that are constantly bombarded, stacking the corpses in rows like cordwood, and helping with the digging of graves. It isn't all that difficult in this soft muck, he says. They try to bury the dead out of range of Fritz's guns so they won't be disturbed again. Elijah goes through the dead men's pockets and takes out coins and combs, pictures of wives and girlfriends and children, Christian medallions to help ward off death, letters from home and letters not yet sent, billfolds, knots of hair, baby teeth, bullets, cigarette cases and lambskins, morphine pills, wedding rings, baptismal certificates, prayer cards and maps and wills and poems. Elijah places these things in envelopes and marks the names of the owners on them and brings them in piles to the officer. Before he leaves a corpse, Elijah tells me he is taken to opening each man's eyes and staring into them, then closing them with his calloused right hand, letting a strange spark of warmth accumulate deep in his gut each time that he does it, noting the color of the iris, knowing that he, Elijah, is the last thing each will see before being placed into the cold mud and water here before they go to their place. Elijah, he says the spark fills his belly when it gnaws for food. And I will end there, and I want to say thank you very much for having me back to my alma mater. It's been a pleasure.